Well, welcome everyone. Those who are going to maybe see the video later. Mike on the audio with us, and we may have Barry or Jim join us, we don't know. We're going to be looking today at kind of the second part of our 3-month study, and this happens to be the area of Ezra and Nehemiah, part of the restoration. We saw in the first part, I think we saw some the activity of Daniel, and was that the first part? I think it was. Yeah, Daniel.
Early and then later.
And then later, yep. And this time we're going to be looking at Ezra and Zechariah in particular, but Ezra right now. There are really two books in the Bible that deal in great measure with what happened after the 70 years of exile. Now we know Daniel was during the exile, but at the end of the exile, the end of the 70 years, some things were going on in the secular side, and then we had two people, Ezra and Nehemiah, and those are the two books in the Old Testament that really give us an indication of some of the things that were going on at the end of the 70 years when the people, the Jews, were coming back to Jerusalem. Just to give you a brief background, the 10 northern tribes had gone into captivity under the conquering of the Syrians. The Syrians were really in what today would be northern Iraq and part of northern Iran. And then later, the Assyrians were overcome by the Medes by the Babylonians. This is where we get the people like Nebuchadnezzar, and this is where Daniel, we find a lot of the stuff going on in Daniel. And then after that, the Babylonians were conquered by what they call the Medo-Persian Empire, but basically it's Persians, the Medes and the Persians. And they're really from modern day Iran. And when they took over the Babylonian Empire, all three of those I just mentioned, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian, had a different way of dealing with people. The Assyrians basically, as I've said many times before, wiped out the culture,
They just killed them.
the religion. They were cruel and heartless people, and they just took a subservient attitude towards the people they conquered. They wanted to wipe out any vestige of what was there before. The Babylonians took a different tack, and that was they would conquer people, and they would even take them into slavery into their own country. But if there were people that had substantial skills, then they would basically introduce them to the Babylonian culture and basically assimilate those people into their culture. That's what happened with Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach and Abednego and others. They were smart. These Jewish young people were smart, and they were well trained, they were well educated, and so they were simply acclimated to the Babylonian culture and way of life, and in many cases they became rulers and governors and satraps and other different levels of government. When the Persians came in, the Babylonians they also allowed the conquered people to keep their culture, to keep their language, to keep their religion. That was very important for what we're going to be studying. And they weren't so much interested in assimilating as they were in simply using the skills that these people had for their own purposes. And then we get to the Persians. Cyrus is the first great Persian king who conquers Babylonia. And the Persians had a little bit different idea, and that was they allowed people to basically keep their culture, keep their language, keep their religion intact, and in many cases in their own land. They weren't interested in taking people and pulling them into the Persian culture as much as they were. Leave them out there. We've conquered them. They're gonna pay us, tribute. They're gonna do what we tell them to do. They'll help our empire, but we're not going to drag them all into slavery here and instead, we're going to keep them out there where they were, let them work the land, let them, have their industries and their trade and everything. But we're going to be in control of things. So that was a different attitude from the Babylonians and the Assyrians both. And that's important as we get to today's lesson. Because Ezra is one of those who is going to come back to Jerusalem. And as we'll see in just a second here, he has a very specific purpose in doing that. So let's look at Ezra, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Does somebody have those would like to read those first 4 verses for us?
I have.
Okay, please, Roberta.
No? Okay. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem.
As Ezra begins this account, this historical account, incidentally, Ezra and Nehemiah are both really historical accounts, kind of like the historical accounts we find in 1st and 2nd King, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and even 1st and 2nd Samuel. These are historical books, not so much books of prophecy like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and some others. But what we find here in the first verse is that it says in the first year of King Cyrus. This is probably in the first year in which he was the king over the entire Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian Empire, huge empire, taking up most of what is modern day Iran, Iraq, part of Turkey, and all the way down really to Egypt. I mean, it was a huge empire, the Persian Empire. But what we find is that it says, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah, Jeremiah had prophesied that there would be a king, Cyrus, who would bring the exiles out of the land of Babylon and would bring them back to their native land, which of course would be Canaan and Israel, Palestine we call it today, or used to call it. But this was prophesied a long time before, and all Ezra really is doing here is saying, look, the prophecy that was made by Jeremiah is coming to pass. And this king, Cyrus, is going to be the one to do just what Jeremiah said he was going to do. Notice it says that the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus. This is to say that, and it's a good indication, I think, in the Old Testament, that God is in control. God is the one who's controlling this. It's not men controlling it, although we sometimes give credit to Cyrus and Darius and others. It's really God who's controlling all this. He controlled what happened when the Assyrians came in and took over the northern tribes. He controlled what happened when Judah was being punished and taken into captivity. He controlled everything that was going on for those 70 years. And now, at the end of those 70 years, he stirs up this King Cyrus. Remember, when King Cyrus takes over in Babylon, he's got all these various peoples from different lands. And he's not interested necessarily in having them all as captives. He'd rather send them back to their native lands, let them reestablish their native culture, and he'll be the one to kind of control all of that. He's going to be in control, but he's going to send these people back now. But this is something that God roused in his spirit, that he needed to get these people back to their native land. And these were not the only ones. The Jews were not the only ones. There were others that Cyrus sent back to reestablish their own culture. Notice in verse 2, though, or verse 1, I'm sorry, the end of verse 1, that he not only was roused to do it, but he proclaimed something and he says he put it in writing. Now, this proclamation would very likely have been like a herald that would have taken the message and would have read it to the various groups that Cyrus was sending back to their native lands, including the Jews. But it would have probably been a proclamation, and that's really kind of what the wording seems to indicate. The old Aramaic and Hebrew wording seems to indicate that this would have been a herald that would have gone and have read this to the people. And yet at the same time, he also put it in writing. So there was a document that would have gone to all the civil servants, the governors and the satraps and some of those other people that were in charge of the government. They would have had in writing what Cyrus wanted to do. And then in verse 2 we find that this is what he actually says. Now in this particular case, this would have been the one that would have been directed very likely to the Jews in particular. And again, it seems like from secular history that this is something that King Cyrus did to a lot of the various groups that were in Babylon. And when he took over, all these groups are there because the Babylonians had brought them in, and now he's wanting to get them back into their own lands. But the proclamation itself, notice it says, the Lord, the God of the heavens. This is really something unusual because up until now, I don't think this term, the Lord of the heavens, has really been, or the God of the heavens, has really been a prominent way of addressing God. The Jews would not necessarily have addressed Jehovah or Yahweh with this particular term. And so this term, the God of the heavens, probably is a reference not simply to the God of the Hebrews, the Israelites, but also probably one of the Persian gods. Might have been Marduk, it might have been some others, but it would have been probably one of the, a reference to one of the gods that the pagan gods that they would have worshipped. Nonetheless, he's relying upon God of the heaven. And notice the second phrase he uses here, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, he didn't control all the earth, but this is just a way of saying that he has given me control of everything that I've come into contact with, that I wanted to conquer. He's given me all this to me for my kingdom. All the kingdoms of the earth would have been simply a way of saying all the boundaries that we know about and that we have decided are worth conquering. He's given them all to me. I own, I'm in charge of it all. Now, the third thing that we find in this particular passage in verse 2 is this idea that he has appointed me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Now, this is in a way a way of actually acknowledging that the Israelite God is a true God, and that in fact God has stirred Cyrus to want to redo the temple in Jerusalem so the Jews can go back to their way of worshiping. And this particular phrase, I think, is the closest thing we have to the understanding that Cyrus, at least in a kind of public way, has acknowledged that the God of the Jews is indeed a very powerful God. It doesn't mean that he accepted him. It simply means that he acknowledged that their God was an important God. It may have been just one of many others in his own mind, but nonetheless, he acknowledged that the Jewish God was a real thing. Then we get to verse 3. Notice that his proclamation indicates that any of his people, may his God be with him, may go to Jerusalem and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. Now, all of the people that had been taken into captivity, and many of them probably were very old, they were young when they were taken into captivity, and some of them had been born in captivity. But there was a choice given here. In verse 3, notice it doesn't say all of you people. He just simply says, and this is a translation I realize, but the thought here is, anybody that wants to go back to Jerusalem and work on this temple, rebuilding the city, can go back. Not everybody went back. There were Jewish people who had established themselves in Babylon, and decided to stay. They didn't all come back. As a matter of fact, we know from the numbers that we find later on in Ezra and Nehemiah that there were many people who apparently stayed in Babylon because they were very comfortable. I mean, if we were taken into captivity today, say into Canada, God forbid, or Mexico, even worse, you know, if somehow or another we were conquered, we were taken there, and then all of a sudden, 70 years later, the opportunity existed for us to come back, there are a lot of people who would probably stay. You know, people like cold weather would probably stay in Canada. People like warm weather stay in Mexico. You know, we wouldn't all return, and neither did all the Jews return. The idea here, though, is that anybody that wanted to, Cyrus was essentially allowing them to participate in this removement back into the promised land, into Palestine, into the old Israelite kingdom, or Judean kingdom, actually.
We also see here where he moves from the God of the heaven to the God in Jerusalem.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
so he's condescending, you know, from who he believes is the true God.
Yeah.
And he talks about the Jewish God, you know, his people, may his God be with him.
Yeah.
And so we see a reduction here in the way he's talking about the God of Israel, almost as he's a tribal God,
Yeah.
because he says the God who resides in Jerusalem.
Right.
So they thought each God was just in his own territory.
Exactly.
And so he's not talking about the God over all the earth.
Right.
He's talking about this local God.
Exactly. And that would have been his from a pagan perspective, that would have been exactly the way he was seeing things. And you see, if you had another group that were captive in Babylon, let's just say for the sake of argument, like Nineveh or something, you know, the Assyrian city. If he was sending those people back, he would have probably mentioned their God as, go back and, you know, rebuild Nineveh, and it's your God, you know, because he was giving due diligence to the fact that all these people had their own culture, their own gods. However they worship, send them back. But in this particular case, as Doug's pointing out, you know, it is a condescension in a way of saying that, you know, this God who's in Jerusalem, go back and do whatever you're going to do to worship him the way you used to. And then 4 kind of carries that thought. Every survivor, he says, wherever he resides, be assisted by the men of that region. Now, not only was he sending them back, but his proclamation was also saying, now look, when these people come back into Jerusalem, you know, those who are already in that region, you know, you need to give some assistance to these people that are coming back to Jerusalem. You're not to treat them, you know, as if they're invaders or something. They're coming back. And I think also not only was it the people that were in the region, which would have been Judah, around Jerusalem, but also carries the thought here that anybody that was in the Persian Empire, and particularly around Babylon, this is where the Jews were, that as they left Babylon to go back to Jerusalem, that the people that were in Babylon could also assist them in this effort. Let every survivor, this would have been probably the Jews, wherever he resides, in other words, anywhere in the kingdom that was a Jewish person, or just people that just wanted help, be assisted by the men of that region. And notice, with silver, gold, goods, livestock, with free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem. Anybody that wanted to participate was free to participate as they went out. And this kind of draws a parallel, I think, to what happened as the Jews, as the Jewish people left, the Hebrew people at that point in time, left Egypt. Remember what happens as they're leaving Egypt. They went and they asked for their neighbors to give them things, and the neighbors were so happy to get rid of them. They were just shoving all sorts of stuff at them, clothes and goods and food and animals, and just like, get the heck out of here, you know. Go. And what do you need? Okay, here it is. And the same idea, I think, is captured in verse 4 here, that not only were they leaving, but anybody could assist them. And in some cases, may have been happy to get rid of them again. And so, you know, what do you need? Okay, we'll give it to you. Get out of here.
You know, that would be kind of, though, a different way, like we do our missionaries. You know, that they wanted to stay, those who were, you know, there in Babylon.
Yeah.
maybe they're too old, maybe they had businesses, whatever. They didn't want to go back.
Mhm.
But this is the way they could support the building of the temple and feel like they were part of it, even though they weren't going to participate in the building
Yeah,
of it.
that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, it's not like these were necessarily the same attitude. The Egyptians were so eager to get rid of the Jews. It's not that these people are eager to get rid of them as much as it is we're willing to support, like Doug says, willing to support you, willing to give you stuff. And it may have been in some cases that maybe they were non-Jewish people who were willing to, get rid of them, wanted to get rid of them. But I think this is more of a free will thing, because, what it says here, along with the free will offering. Just, we're willing to help you. And that is kind of more like the missionary thing that we have today. I think that's a good point. Good point. Let's turn to the next section, which is verses 5 through 11. Somebody have 5 through 11? Want to read those for us?
Go ahead.
No.
My left eye is,
Oh, you're.
my left
okay.
eye's all fuzzy.
No, I can't read.
Okay,
Yeah.
5 through what?
5 through 11.
I wasn't paying.
So long. That's
wasn't-
okay.
Then the heads of the fathers' household of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites arose, even anyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. All those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables, aside from all that was given as a freewill offering. Also King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and put in the house of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had then brought out by the hand of the, I don't know,
Oh, Mithridath. Yeah.
the treasurer, and he counted them out of Sheshbazzar and prince of Judah. Now this was the number 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver dishes, 29 duplicates, 30 gold bowls, 410 silver bowls of a second kind, and 1,000 other articles. All the articles of gold and silver numbered 5,400. Sheshbazzar brought them all up with the exiles who went up from Babylon to Jerusalem. My goodness. That's a lot of stuff.
Yes, a lot of stuff.
And I
That may
thought
not have been everything. Notice in verse 5, it mentions specifically here the family heads of Judah and Benjamin. Now the reason for that is because the other 10 tribes have gone into Assyria captivity 170 years or so before, had basically been not really lost in the sense that they didn't have some family identification, but they had been lost in the sense that in many cases they intermarried. In some cases they died off. In some cases they couldn't trace necessarily the lineage back. In fact, as those 10 tribes, in some cases became what in the New Testament were the Samaritans. They were kind of half Jew and half pagan, and they kept part of the Jewish culture and religion, and another part they didn't keep. If you remember the story of Jesus with the woman at the well, she was citing the fact that the Samaritans expected a Messiah of some sort. So they did keep part of the Jewish culture intact. But Judah and Benjamin were the two tribes in the south that kind of maintained their identity during this 70 years of captivity. And notice it says also, along with the priests and the Levites. Now, the priestly class would have been those from the family of Aaron. The Levites are those who assisted. In some ways, to bring it down to today's way of looking at things, the priests, you might say, were like our pastors today. They're the ones who conducted the worship services. They're the ones who offered the sacrifices. And the Levites, in some ways, are like deacons. I mean, if I had to draw a parallel to today, we'd say pastors and deacons. And notice, everyone whose spirit God had aroused. Now, some of them, God didn't rouse their spirit, perhaps, to actually go back to Jerusalem. Like Doug was saying earlier, they may have had business interests there. They may have been happy living in Babylon, now under the Persian authorities. But those who had been prepared, God prepared the families, he prepared the priests, he prepared the Levites, he prepared other people, obviously in civic responsibilities, to go back. Now in verse 6, notice we got the same thing we had a moment ago. Their neighbors supported them. Notice with the same kind of thing, silver, gold, goods, livestock, valuables. And notice again, all that was given in a free will offering. Sometimes we get focused so much on tithing in the Old Testament, which was very real and it was demanded, that we forget that there are many places in the Old Testament where there was a free will offering given. When it came to building the temple, if you all recall, there was so much given that they had to tell the people, stop giving. They were free will offerings of material and gold and silver and articles and jewels and things. And finally they had to tell the people, look, we got so much. Don't give us any more. We got enough already. This was a free will offering they were given. It wasn't a demand from God that they do. This was a free will offering they gave from their heart. And we find that same kind of offering in the New Testament. Particularly in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. We find that this free will offering was a kind of offering that the Macedonians were giving to the people in Jerusalem who were suffering at the time. So in the Old Testament we find the same thing that we find in the New Testament. Notice then the third thing starting in verse 7, that when Nebuchadnezzar had defeated Judah, and had literally, it was actually the third time, 586. 586 would have been the third time that the Babylonians would have come against Jerusalem. And that third time, they tore the temple down, took everything out of the temple. Anything that had any value, any gold or silver or precious stones, anything that had any kind of value, they took it back to Babylon. But in verse 7, we find that Cyrus was not only saying, go back and rebuild your temple, but he was also saying, look, I got a lot of this stuff in storage here. Why don't you get some of this stuff and take this stuff back to the temple because it belongs in Jerusalem. There's something odd about a guy, I think, like Cyrus. We find him, I think, almost a noble kind of person in the Old Testament. In the sense that he realized this stuff really wasn't his. He realized where it came from, and he was willing to let it go back to where it belonged. But notice the stuff in verse 8 and 9 and 10. He had them brought out under the supervision of Mithridath, who was his treasurer. And in public, they counted them out. They literally counted out all the stuff that was supposed to go back that had come over in the Babylonian captivity. And notice it says who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. Now, some people have said that this may have been another name for one of the Israelites who actually led back. Now, I haven't heard it, I didn't find anywhere where it says specifically Nehemiah, but probably it was another civil servant who was maybe even of Babylonian descent, because the name Sheshbazzar would have been similar to some of the others, like Nebuchadnezzar and others. Might have been the governor of Judah territory. There
are some thinking maybe this is a descendant of the high priest, but that's his Babylonian name, just like David and
Yes.
Meshach, and Abednego were given Babylonian names.
Yeah.
He could have had a Babylonian name also.
Yes, it's very possible. Yeah.
It's interesting too that these are the very vessels that Belshazzar drank out of that caused his doom
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
for the Medes and the Persians to take over.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. I almost forgot about that. But yeah, we just had that a couple of weeks ago with the handwriting on the wall and all the drunken orgies they were having. And you're right. These are some of the items that they had brought out
Right.
to really. It was wrong for them to use them in this way. Notice the numbers. 30 gold basins, 1,000 silver bases, gold bowls, silver bowls, other articles. And there's an issue with the number, because if you add all these up, I think it only comes to like 2,900 or something. So there were other articles that aren't even mentioned here necessarily. And the gold and silver articles, all of them total 5,400. So these that are mentioned here are just some. And as you were pointing out, Roberta, this is a lot of stuff, but there's even more. And this may have only been a little over half of what was actually there.
Notice where it says 29 silver knives?
Yeah.
That makes me think somebody lost one.
So this may have been like the silver we sometimes see at the shop out there.
The resale shop.
Yeah, the resale shop. It's like, yeah, there's a fork missing. You
Or
know?
there's one plate.
There's one plate. Yes, yeah. It's a serving of 8, but in this case
Minus
it's only minus one plate. Yeah, yeah.
Or rather, are round numbers.
Around right.
29 knives tells me somebody lost something.
Right. Yeah. Now notice it says that this is all the stuff that Belshazzar brought out. And again, I think what you see is that God was directing all this. He's directing Cyrus. In an intelligent way, Cyrus is doing this on his own, if you will, but because he has a purpose in mind. But at the same time, we see that God is behind this. He's kind of moving this in the direction that God wants to move it. And that is, get the people back. They in a way, it's almost like, look, they served their 70 years prison sentence. Now it's time for them to get out. They're on parole. They're going back home, And from a purely secular standpoint, it's a wise decision on Cyrus's part, which is get them back out there, get the land improved. It's going to be, I own it, so I might as well improve it. Get these people out of Babylon. They're slaves, yeah, but get them back to where they belong, and let them be productive citizens for Persia. And at the same time, God is behind all this because he said that's what he was going to do, and now he's fulfilling his duty. I don't know when you study the history of the Persian wars with the Greeks, which comes later under Darius the first and second, one of the things you find is that the Persian army was made up of so many different components. They had horsemen from one tribe, from one area. They had foot soldiers from another. They had charioteers from another. And when they came to war against the Greeks later, one of the things you see is that Persia had all these different contingents of soldiers and things to fight against the Greeks because it was such a huge empire. And where they had horsemen, they used them in battle. Where they had people that knew how to drive chariots, they had them. Where they had people that could throw a spear, they had spear throwers. Where they had bow and arrow archers, they used them. And so the Persians were very smart in the sense they put together all these places because they had already sent these people back to reestablish themselves in their kingdom. And when it came to war, they just drugged the people they needed from every different area and sent them to war.
Well, sending them back to reestablish their own kingdoms or whatever you want to call it, but again, keeping them connected at the same time is what allowed them to do that. They gave them their freedom, so in turn they felt compelled to be part of the bigger picture.
Right. I mean, there was fear involved too.
Well, yeah,
You didn't want to go against the Persian army because, I mean, they could be as ruthless as any other army if they wanted to be. But the point I'm trying to make here is that King Cyrus was a smart dude. He was a smart guy. He had a way that he wanted to set up his kingdom, which was different from Syria. It was different from Babylon. But the point I really want to make is that this is God behind all of it. That God said what he was going to do, and now he's doing it. And he does it by rousing the heart of Cyrus. He puts in Cyrus's heart the idea that, yeah, Cyrus, you may be thinking this, but I'm going to tell you this is the right thing to do. It's almost as if God is saying, yep, this is what you need to do. Go out there and do it. So God is behind all of this. He's not just sitting passively waiting for something to happen. He's behind all of it. Let's go to the last section here, which is in Ezra chapter 2, verses 1 and 2.
I'll read it.
Please.
It says, "These now are the people of the province which came from the captive exiles King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had deported to Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. They came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sarai, Realiah, Mordecai, I wonder if that's the same Mordecai,
No.
Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, Bahat. You thought you had to.
Thank you.
I was actually, I already had those underlined. I was just waiting to see if anybody was going to volunteer. If they weren't, I was going to go ahead and volunteer. But thank you, Doug. I'm glad you did that. There are a lot of names here.
Yeah.
Okay. Notice.
And you think it's just, I mean, I read that earlier, I know what I can't do. I know my limitations.
I forgot we skipped last week, so I'm
Yeah.
clueless.
Oh, okay. Notice these are the people. Now, look, notice of the province. Now, this would have probably been the province of Judah. It would have been a huge area. I mean, this might have been the whole western end of the kingdom of Persia at this particular point in time. And these are the people of the province who came from those captive exiles that Nebuchadnezzar had brought back to Babylon. Notice, he had deported them to Babylon. So they were still, like the Assyrians, they were taking slaves. Now, Cyrus didn't necessarily, they had slaves, don't get me wrong. Persia had slaves. But not all these various peoples need to be in the same place in Babylon. Darius' his idea again, get the people back, make the land productive, it's going to help me, you know, and there's a sense in which they're going to be a little freer than what they were here. But the important thing here is, as verse 1 points out, that they came back to their own towns. Now, in some cases, it is probable that the towns may have not even been there. They may have been wiped out, they may have been abandoned, it's hard to say. But they were coming back to the area that they knew. We have 11 of them mentioned here. There's another accounting, which I think is in Nehemiah, in which there are 12. Some of the same names are here, but about 12 different tribes. Zerubbabel is the first mentioned here. We find him also prominently mentioned in Nehemiah as one of the first waves of people to come back was under Zerubbabel. So he would have been an Israelite, very probably an Israelite. Maybe this is a Babylonian name that, as Doug pointed out earlier, it was common to give them Babylonian names. But this person in particular led the first group back. It was a small group, wasn't a very large one. Jeshua is a word that literally is Joshua. When you see Jeshua, it's Joshua, and in fact, in the New Testament, it's Jesus. That's the same word. I mean, Jesus, Joshua have a very similar etymological background. That is, the word comes from the same root word.
Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus, yeah. And Jeshua. These are all forms of that Joshua. Now, this is not obviously a Joshua who led the people into the land of Palestine. That was many, many centuries before this. Nehemiah is mentioned here. And Nehemiah probably was the Nehemiah, very likely. Although that name was a common name, so we don't know for sure. This may have been one of the early returns, and Nehemiah comes a little bit later because he's a cupbearer in the land of Babylon. So this may not have been the same person.
Probably not, because it's 22 years later,
Yeah.
you know, so probably not, just like Mordecai is probably
Right.
not the same Mordecai.
Right. Sariah is probably a form of the word Azariah, which was a kind of common name. As a matter of fact, one of the three Hebrew children that we find in the book of Daniel, I think Azariah was one of those. That was the Jewish name. And this Sariah may have been a form of that. And then you find these others and all the other names that are here. I'm not going to try to pronounce them. Doug did a fine job with that. But notice that what is happening here is that all these people are coming back, and they're coming back essentially to the area that they knew to reestablish their roots there. There are many different administrative regions within the Persian Empire, and as I said a moment ago, Judah and the whole land of Palestine, and maybe even up into Lebanon and Jordan and Syria, may have been one huge province over which somebody would have had some control. And Sheshbazzar, the name we found earlier, that may have actually been Zerubbabel. One of the people I consulted said that Zerubbabel may have been listed here as one of the Jews, and this other person we had earlier may have been the same name. It's very, very hard to say. Notice though that these are all part, whether it's 11 here or 12 in the other, in Nehemiah, I believe it is, that there's 12 tribes coming back. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the 10 tribes in the north were a part of this, but it's interesting that there were at least 11 or 12 that are coming back to the same area of Judah. We do know that among these, and this one of these descendants was the, let's see, Zechariah was a son of Shetiel, and he was a grandson of one of the final kings, which was Jehoiakim. And this is something that our authors of our lesson pointed out. So what you have here is somebody who was of the tribe of David, and he was a civil person, if you will, a civic person, and he would have acted, in a sense, he would have acted as a king, even though he may not have carried that title. But this is a link between the pre-exile and now the post-exile, where they're coming back, that one of the people coming back there would have been somebody that would have been in the government, on the government side. Now, another person coming back here is Yeshua, and again, that was Joshua. And it may have been that he was out of the line of the priests that we talked about earlier, the Aaron tribe that would have essentially formed the priesthood. This Jeshua may have been one of those people, some people say. If that's the case, then what you have in the people coming back, and these 12 names here at least, seems to be a part of the civil government, but it also seems to be a part of the religious community, so that both of them were coming back into the land of Judah to reestablish the Jewish faith, the Israelite faith there. And again, we don't lose the connection between what happened before the exile and what happens after the exile, because some of these families probably continued on through the exile and then came back to the land of Judah, which in a way would indicate at some point that as Jesus comes through that line, that he would have had a background of both the civil side, the government, and also the kingly side, and also from the priestly side, when he finally does arrive on the earth. You know, we say Christmas Day, whenever Christmas was, which probably wasn't in December.
September,
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah. Some people put it in spring, some people put it in fall. And we think it was not December.
It
I'm
really,
pretty sure
it
it
really
wasn't.
doesn't matter.
And it doesn't necessarily
It
matter.
doesn't matter.
That's right. it doesn't.
When matter doesn't matter near as much as, yes, it happened.
Right, right. But the point here, I think, is that as they're coming back, they're not coming back and reestablishing something totally different. And we'll see that more, I think, next week, and then later on, I think we get into Nehemiah at the end, if I remember right. Let me double check that. I don't want to speak out of turn here. Yeah, we'll see Nehemiah and Esther at the kind of the third month. I guess that's going to probably be February. We'll get to that. Yeah, but
Yeah, it's interesting to me that Isaiah prophesied about their restoration coming back hundreds of years before it, and even called him by name.
right, exactly.
In Isaiah 45:1, it says, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him, and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the doors shut, and the gates will not be shut." So, you know, here God in his prophecy prophesies about Cyrus, you know, letting the people go, but not only letting them go, but that he indeed was called by his name,
Mm-hmm.
which shows that God knows everything, past, present, and future.
In advance. That is important. I think one of the things I find interesting, and I'm not an Ezra scholar, I'm not a Nehemiah scholar by any means, but the fact that these two books really are the books of the restoration, of the coming back, I find fascinating, because all the prophecies, as Doug was pointing, the prophecy of Cyrus, many other prophecies that were made in Jeremiah in particular and Isaiah, they came to pass exactly as God said they would come to pass. Just as we have so many prophecies about the coming of Jesus in Isaiah, several chapters in Isaiah, we have the same prophecies, not only in Isaiah, but also in some of the minor prophets about things that are going to occur, and they occur just precisely as the Scripture says they were going to occur. And that's what I find interesting about Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Ezra comes back to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah, as we'll find later, comes back to rebuild the wall. And I think that's a critical thing too, because again, you have the reestablishment of the religion, and then later you have the reestablishment of the city itself, of the kingly city, if you will, the city of David. Other thoughts or comments? We're kind of at the end of our time here. We got a late start. Mike, it was good to have you with us.
Yep.
Hope this is profitable for everybody. Doug has next week's lesson, which I think is in Zechariah. And then we'll have the temple in the third lesson, and then we have a doctrine. We missed last week, so we're kind of spaced out a little bit
It
differently.
was on
here.
the birth of Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, was it really? Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. That was really a good time, good timing for that, right? Last week? There you go. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Doug, you want to dismiss us in prayer?
Father, again, we are so thankful to be able to be here. We pray for those who couldn't be here physically, and those we missed on the phone today because of technical issues. And Father, just continue to be with us and to bless us, and we give you the praise and thank you, dear God, for this new year, that we have a clean slate, a new start, and Father, help us to use it wisely. We praise you in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, bye, Michael.